Welcome to Design Santa Barbara. This week we are in Santa Barbara Design Center and we are once again joined by noted Santa Barbara historian and author Erin Graffy. Erin is going to share the history of some of Santa Barbara's most important events, including fiestas and old Spanish days. Thank you very much for joining us again. I appreciated you being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I was always fascinated by fiestas. There's actually few events we have in Santa Barbara that it's epic.
It is epic.
And a lot of people come every year, and I've been here almost 30 years, and I go like, you can't see the same show 30 years in a row, the same thing. And yes, people do.
Yeah.
So if you would please.
Well, it is a great festival, and it is probably one of the oldest in California, if not the oldest, and it has so many interesting components to it. And it was started, how many years have we got? 90-something years now. It was started in 1924. And like so many festivals, it was started probably by businessmen. And businessmen saying, you know, let's get some people into town. But the interesting part was, in Santa Barbara, our big tourist season back then was during the winter. And everybody came out maybe as early as the late October. There would be people who would be the snowbirds from the East Coast. New York, Chicago, Pennsylvania, all those areas back there, Ohio. And they want to get out of the freezing cold. They'd pack up all their things on a train car, box car, ship it out to Santa Barbara and stay here during those cold months. And they'd leave around March once everything starts thawing out. But the business people here said, you know, it's so beautiful here during the summer as well. It seems a shame. There ought to be something that we could get started here. They'd had a couple of athletic kind of special events that had happened in the turn of the century. But now they would like to have something a little more serious, something maybe to rival Mardi Gras in New Orleans. So they're looking about what should be the theme. And one of the local editors from the local paper, Michael Phillips from the Morning Press, and he said, you know what we ought to call this, what we ought to base this on is our own history, the old Spanish days. That's how they referred to the 19th century period. And they had had a festival, just kind of a grassroots festival, a few years before that, around 1920 and 1921, called La Primavera. And the old timers in town, the families that went back for generations, had kind of created this artsy event where they dressed up in the costumes of their great-great-grandparents and sang the old Spanish songs, and they performed the old Spanish dances, kind of for themselves and for anybody who was caring to, you know, follow this. So now in the 1924, here's the business people, and this man says, we ought to call it the old Spanish days. And everybody went, oh, that's a great idea, because it's a theme. People will be dressed a certain way. They'll have certain kinds of food that's different, you know, Mexican, Spanish food. They'll have the costumes. The whole thing was just transfixing. People just loved it. Now, people say, oh, I thought we started Fiesta because the Lobero Theater had opened, and that's why we started Fiesta. Well, kind of yes and no. These people who were starting a special event for tourists were all on their own. They started this whole thing. Meanwhile, in the other corner of town, just like you have today, you have crossover, some people that are going to be on this organization, and they're also on this organization, and they also belong to this organization. So you have some of that crossover. And the Lobero was celebrating its rebuilding, and they are going to open with a big show in August. And Fiesta was originally planned for September. But as time goes on, it's a very new event, and they're trying to put on this, that, the other thing to be part of this festival. They were, you know, starting to run short of funds. So they said, maybe we should move this up to August and open at the same time, because people maybe will be attracted to come for the Lobero. So they hooked up forces and said, we're going to piggyback on you. Our festival is 3 days long. It'll take in place in the middle of your 2-week run of your show. And so that's where the crossover came. And so this festival has grown and grown, and like I said, they called it Old Spanish Days. Fiesta means party, but they called it Old Spanish Days. They didn't say come to Fiesta. They might say Old Spanish Days Fiesta, but if you look at the early posters, it's Old Spanish Days, Old Spanish Days. Now, if you were new to town and you didn't have relatives going back to the founding of the Presidio, then how are you going to get dressed up? Well, you might kind of fashion a suit together. Maybe you might go to a seamstress. But of course, remember, we had just been coming out of just about the time that the Flying A studio was moving down into Los Angeles. And we had Hollywood people up here all these years. So we knew about the Western Costume Company. So they would come up with a big truck filled with costumes of this era, and people would hop onto the truck, go through there, pick out something to rent, and then have their very fashionable costume to wear during that week.
Early 20th century Halloween store, basically, on wheels.
On wheels. Not Halloween, the fanciest, beautiful, beautiful designers who are building, who are designing costumes for Hollywood. So even if it's supposed to be the little peasant in the story of the Californians back in the 19th century, believe me, that would have been some hotshot designer doing that peasant costume, for the movie. So very beautifully attired.
I have a quick question, actually. This is probably interesting. We call it Old Spanish Days, and I've been hearing this for 30 years. It was Spanish-speaking people, but it used to be Mexico. So it was really not 19th century, wasn't...
So that's a very good question, because our Old Spanish Days that we are celebrating was under Mexican rule. So of course, the Spanish come here starting 1769 in Santa Barbara, 1782. Spain is the guy in charge. The people down in Mexico, because everything is under Spanish rule, and they get the idea of what they see in America, the rebellions. So they say, this is a good idea. We want to have our own independence, enough of Spain. So they rebel, and now Mexico has its independence. And now Mexico is also in charge of Alta California. But under that time period, under Mexico rule is when we have this very unique time that we call Old Spanish Days, just simply, as you pointed out, because the language was Spanish. The Rancho period took place, there's no hardcore dates for it, but under Mexican rule, because Mexico is giving out land grants where they're going to develop these ranchos, where they're going to raise the cattle, which is part of our Rancho period. And it ended when the cattle died off, probably in the 1860s from a drought. So that for sure was the end of it. Kind of started slowing down after the gold rush because the American Yankees come in. So let's look at Santa Barbara. So we've been under Mexican rule, and under Mexican rule, very little happened in Alta California. So people are just taking care of themselves because the Mexican government really isn't doing anything. They're building, the bad news is they're not doing anything. The good news is they're not doing anything. They're not interfering. So we're all kind of taking care of ourselves.
They had no interest to come out here. There was no gold found, and there is no oil digging back then. So
and
why would they come here?
They're just busy with Mexico, and they just want to make sure that nobody kind of comes in and tries to take over Mexico. They're just busy because that's the center of governmental gravity, so to speak. But now the Americans, after the gold rush, start coming into Santa Barbara, into California, of course, and then eventually and definitely into Santa Barbara. And when they come in, they are not content to have the adobe houses. They're going to come in as Yankees and build their wooden houses, right? So they start building that, and they build a city of houses, a little town. Prior to this, during the Rancho period, what people don't realize is there were no towns. There was the Presidio here from the Spanish period, Presidio here, San Francisco, Monterey, San Francisco, and in between there were no towns. So if you are coming along on your horse and you're trying to figure out where to stay, you're looking for another vaquero, cowboy, to say, where is civilization? And they will take you to a man's house and you will stay, for this very hospitable man who says, welcome, come stay in my house. But to go back to this period of the Americans coming in, it's very different. They come in and they start building banks, hotels. And the music is different. Instead of these quiet little guitar playing and these very serene kind of stuff, you come in with the piano and the honky-tonk and the big brass band and Sousa and all of this kind of aural dissonance compared to how peaceful it was before. And we bring in carriages, you know, we're getting more access to come into Santa Barbara. So at the end of that time period, the 19th century, people would say, remember the old days when it wasn't before the Yankees came and messed it all up? You know, maybe they like all the new inventions, but still, remember that old, everybody knew each other.
They still do. People still say, remember the old days?
That's right. And there they would call it, remember the old Spanish days. So that's where that term was just very kind of a natural grassroots response. So it didn't mean under the Spanish period with the Presidio soldiers and all that. It just meant this wonderful, beautiful time where everybody took care of one another. There is no government. There is no welfare to take care of someone. We just take care of everybody.
That's wonderful. I've asked that many people. Nobody knew it like you do. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So there's a lot more questions to be answered. We will be back after the commercial break.